Hi, I'm Khawar. I'm a first-year student in the PhD program Communication and Digital Media here at NC State. And today I'm going to talk about this project that I worked on the last year for like 6 months or so, and a global season of talks. And I worked with Perl, which is an open source organization, and I kind of conducted this entire project to understand their online documentation and suggest some ways in which the presence of the online documentation on the website can be improved. Just to give you a little bit of context of what Global Season of Docs is, if you're not aware of it, so they are the open source organizations and they don't have money because they usually rely on volunteers, and because of the connection and the network of volunteers they have, they're kind of building their tools and also their documentation along the way. But the problem is that their documentation isn't as good. And there are several reasons for that. One of those is that when the tool is developing, there are a lot of people contributing to it, resolving bugs every single day, and the documentation cannot really keep pace with it. And then on the other hand, since they don't have money to hire the people, to the documentation specialists, it really kind of lags when it comes to the tool developing on the one hand and the documentation kind of lagging behind. Then on the other hand, we have technical writers. And we want work. We also need to pay bills because we need to, right? So the thing is that we need experience. There are technical writers, especially students in all of the schools and programs, and they need some work, they need some experience to get into the industry. But there is this disconnect between them. The open source organizations are not really connected to the technical writers, and the technical writers need that bridge to kind of connect to the organizations. This is where Big Brother steps in. So what Google does is that Google tells the technical writers that I'm going to find you some work, and then tells the open source organization that you don't have to worry about the money. So Google sponsors this particular program, and what happens is that technical writers, they submit their proposals to the organizations, get connected with them, and then work with them for like 3 to 6 months based on the length of the project. And then at the end, they develop some reports which kind of helps the organizations improve their documentation. And this is what I worked on with Perl last year for like 6 months, starting from May up until the mid of November. And just to give you a little bit of context of what Perl is an open source programming language. It started somewhere around 1980, and it's still being used by a lot of organizations. But there are a lot of problems with the documentation of Perl. If you look at this one GIF that I have, so this is the existing web page that they have for their documentation, and you keep scrolling on it, it's never going to end. I remember that when I first started working on the project, so I had to take breaks after looking at first 5 or 6 documents because there's so much going on there. And for a user who's not aware of Perl, it's not difficult to get lost in their documentation, really. They have over hundreds of core documents which have FAQs, reference articles, tutorials, and a lot of other documentation. So the problem here was to identify the issues with the existing documentation and then come up with a strategy which they can use in the future to improve their online documentation. And the book or the literature that I sought inspiration from was mainly Megan Casey's content audit or content strategy toolkit. And that was really helpful because it kind of lists all the steps that you can take in improving any online or offline documentation. So the first step was to work on the content audit and analysis of the existing documentation. What I did in this was that I went through all the existing documents and spent a lot of time on the individual web pages. I found out what the issues were. For example, I looked at the content and saw whether it was outdated, whether there were some missing links, or there need to be some connections between different documents here. And then I created a content audit spreadsheet at the end, which was a pretty long sheet. I cannot show it here, but you can check it out in the report, which I'm going to share later. The second one was the gap analysis. Here, the goal was to understand now. In the content audit, we got an idea about the existing state of the documentation and its issues. Now, the next phase was to see where the documentation wants to go in the next few months or years. And this is where gap analysis came in. We looked at it from 2 different angles. One was from the perspective of the organization. I talked to the people who are working with Perl and the main contributors and everything, and got an idea what do they want to do with the documentation in the future. And then on the other hand, I talked to some users who were using Perl or were kind of interested in using Perl in the future and saw what the problems were that they were facing when using Perl's documentation. This helped in understanding the gaps between the existing documentation and the goals of the documentation. And at the end of it, I created another very long spreadsheet which listed some of the tasks, some of the gaps that need to be addressed. And then the third phase was the information architecture, where we focused more on the organization of the information and the links between different documents which need to be kind of created. Some links were missing, some were there, and how we can use some external resources to strengthen the online documentation. And the last one was to create a roadmap for the future. So bringing all of the things together, in this last phase, we created a long list of tasks and projects along with their limitations, which were kind of figured out when we talked to the contributors of the Perl and saw that what are the limitations that they are facing, because the platform that they're using, it doesn't support some of the media elements. So we have to take that into consideration. And then we created a roadmap for the future, which has all the tasks and projects, and they can use that to build the documentation in the days to come. This is a brief idea of the timeline that we followed. As you can see here that the gap analysis and information architecture, that phase took a lot of time. And one of the reasons was that we had to get in touch with the users, and also there were several meetings held with the people who are working at Perl at this point. So that took kind of a lot of back and forth discussions, and that took a lot of time. Some of the major findings. So there were a lot of issues with the existing documentation of Perl. The major issues included the navigation, as I showed you in the GIF earlier, that you can keep on scrolling on the web page. So one of the issues there was no static menu, all-time existing menu on the page. So when a user scrolls down to the bottom, you kind of lose track of the things that you saw at the top. And even when you click on a single document, what you see is that there is no menu of the headings or subtitles inside that document anywhere on the web page. So there are some very long documents, and you scroll down at the bottom. Now you have to jump on any other heading. You have to go all the way up again. The other one was about the organization. The documents on the single web page that's hosting all the documentation at this point, they were not organized very well. There were no clearly defined sections or subsections, and they were not talking about specific themes or specific target audience groups that they were going to use. So this was another problem that we saw. The third one was about the presentation of the documentation, using some media elements, making it looking some sort of aesthetically pleasing in some ways. Some of the solutions that we came up with, one of those was to create a better information architecture, which we proposed at the end of the third phase. And then to reorganize documentation, we created in that particular information architecture, we proposed some new sections and subsections that could be created in the documentation, and then also listed down some of the ways in which different sections could be linked to each other. So building those cross links and strengthening the documentation. And then another one was to work on a comprehensive style guide. Now, Perl has a style guide at this point, but the problem is that most of the documents are not following that style guide. And the style guide itself is not comprehensive enough, because things keep on happening, new features keep on coming in, and the documentation is not able to keep pace with that. So building a new style guide, which is more comprehensive and is sort of a living document which everyone can contribute to, and then making sure that all the other documents stick to that standards, that's also something that can be done in the future. Some of the challenges, time was the major constraint here. We had 6 months and there was so much to do. There were so many documents. So one of the things that we couldn't do was that we couldn't conduct a formal user research. We only got some feedback from 3 or 4 users. If we had more time to conduct a formal user study, I definitely think that would have improved the findings as well. And then we couldn't actually edit the individual documents. The entire time that we spent was kind of spent in understanding the existing documentation and creating a plan for its improvement. We didn't have enough time to go back and edit individual documents. And then we also didn't have any graphic designer or any other such expert on the team. So we couldn't focus on the presentation or the aesthetics of the documentation itself. And these are some of the references that I use. Feel free to check these out. Just a small reminder that the call for proposals for Google Season of Docs 2022 is now open. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about that or about the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I just wanted to see if anyone in the audience, in-person audience, had any questions? Question? Okay, let me just ask the Zoom audience if anyone here has any questions.